Hello everyone, my name is Dr Cat Hobaiter and it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce you to my work today. So let's get going. Language might be the most powerful social tool any species has ever evolved. With language we can articulate any idea that comes into our minds and share it with the minds of those around us. We use it for poetry, we use it for theoretical physics, we use it for gossip, to talk about our friends and our neighbours, we use it to put cat memes on the internet. We use it to inform, we use it to deceive. But despite centuries of thought and decades of research, today we still have very little understanding of how and why this remarkable capacity evolved. What was the first sentence? What did we as a species need to communicate that took us beyond the systems of signals that we see used by other animals in the world around us today? First of all, a little primer. When I say evolution, some of you might be thinking of something like this, a slow progression from simple life to the pinnacle of civilization that is humankind today. Well, for starters, this is 100% not how evolution works. Okay, there we go, that's better. All the incredible species we see around us today evolved along their own path. Now, humans are no more evolved than any other species you see, whether that be a chimpanzee or an earwig. Each of us has evolved to solve the particular problems that we each face as a species. We're adapted to our own niche. Now, as humans, we are pretty incredible in many ways, but we're fairly useless at, say, hunting underwater or flying through the air. Now, even when we compare ourselves to the amazing primates that we see, there's such a diverse set of skills and behaviours expressed in each species, and exploring them is a pretty good check on any grandiose ideas we might get about our own relative importance in the world. So while we tend to ask, can they do what we do? I think we mustn't forget to ask, can we do what they do? Now, having said all of that, as a species, we are pretty self-obsessed, and we want to know what makes us, us. For a long time, one of the behaviours we thought was uniquely human was tool making. We don't just use tools, but we made our own, and then used them for all sorts of things, whether it was hunting or making clothes. But when Jane Goodall infamously observed the Gombe chimpanzees making and using stick tools to dip for termites, Louis Leakey wrote to her with the now famous quote, "Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as humans." Now, we had a pretty good idea of what a tool was, and we definitely were not ready at that point to accept chimpanzees as humans, so we did what we always do. We shifted the goalposts and we redefined man. And the latest version of this is man the linguist. Our learning, our culture, our lives, all of it depends on language. So how do you work out whether or not humans are the only species to have language? Well, one way to do it is to find out whether or not language is something to do with our species' genetic makeup or the environment that we grow up in. Is it nature, or is it nurture, or is it both? Now, while we very definitely would not be allowed to do this, imagine that you left a baby on a desert island. Okay, now it's fairly clear that if they somehow survived, they would never learn to use language in anything like the way that we see it in the world around us today. And indeed, we know from studies of orphan children who grow up in places with very limited social care that their language development is often one of the first and most profound things to suffer. But is living in a language environment enough? Or is there something that is unique about human biology that means that only humans can put the language pieces together? Well, one other way to ask what would happen if an individual from another species tried to learn human language would be to raise them in a human language environment. And that's exactly what they tried doing in the 1960s and 70s. A series of researchers took infant apes and tried to raise them as if they were human children, to find out whether or not that might be enough for them to learn language, or if there really is something in our biological makeup that we have and they don't. One of the first apes they raised this way was Vicky. Vicky was raised by the Hays. They raised her as near as possible as a human child, and they raised her together with their young son, who was about the same age. Now, over the next 6 years, Vicky learned almost all the things that a young human toddler would learn. She dressed herself, she sat at the table to eat her breakfast with a spoon, she stacked blocks, she played games, but she didn't learn to speak. Now, even after years of intensive voice training, which is not something that you wouldn't typically need to do with a human child, she only had 4 words, and it's pretty generous to call them words. She would sort of croak out mama, papa, up, and cup, but you could tell how hard it was for her to force those sounds out. So that's it, right? Okay, no language. Humans really do have something that other apes don't. But not so fast. First of all, Vicky understood an awful lot of human language. And second of all, language is not speech. Human languages come in many different forms, be they spoken or signed or written. Maybe it was just that Vicky couldn't produce spoken language, and that might not be all that surprising. Chimpanzees and humans are incredibly similar in many ways, but one of the areas in which we differ is in how we vocalize sounds. Now, interestingly enough, at about the same time, their young son started to incorporate an awful lot of chimpanzee calls into his language learning, and they decided it was about time to stop the study. But at the same time, those studies of tool use that we were seeing from the wild, from Jane Goodall's work in Gombe and then from other sites around Africa, were teaching us about chimpanzees' amazing tool making and about how dexterous their hands could be. And researchers realized that there was another way they could try to ask the same question by exploring whether or not apes might be able to learn language in its signed forms. Here's an old video of the young chimpanzee Washoe being taught.
From the very start, we work to get particular signs associated with particular activity. Come, come, come. A game with a doll. Where? Where? Where is the play baby? Where? Smart wash.
Now, this study was much more successful. Washoe learned over 100 signs, and to me, much more importantly, she started to use the signs in a way that was very reminiscent of what young children do when they start to explore their language. She would babble herself to sleep. She would communicate with other chimps in sign. And when she was older and she adopted a young male infant, the researchers, who at that point were very careful not to sign in front of Luli, were able to record that he learned a lot of signs. They could show that he learned his signs directly from Washoe. But the absolute queen of the ape sign language projects was Coco. Coco was a gorilla who passed away just recently, and who had apparently learned over 1,000 signs. And again, to me, what was much more impressive was not the vocabulary, but it was how she was using them. She was reported to apparently talk about her dreams. She would gossip. She even fibbed. So there's a great anecdote that's being told when she was left alone in a room at the university that had a potted plant in the corner. Now, Coco is a gorilla. What happens when you leave a gorilla anywhere near a plant? They eat it, constantly eating. And so the researchers come back in and they ask her where the plant is. And she signed that an intern that she didn't really like at the time, Bill, ate it. Now, the researchers respond, people don't eat plants, Coco, gorillas eat plants. And at this point, she signs the other gorilla. Now, this is just like a little kid caught with their hand in the cookie jar, right? And they're doubling down on the fib in the face of kind of all evidence to the contrary. It's so reminiscent of what you see young children doing with their language. So again, it's not just that they learned these very large sets of signs, but they were starting to use them in a very human-like way, apparently. And then came Nim. Nim Chimpsky was named as a sort of thumb to the nose to Noam Chomsky, who, as a very famous linguist, was always adamant that human language was really a uniquely human trait. Nim lives in a townhouse in Manhattan, and this was the first study to try and really rigorously, systematically document data on these ape sign language studies. There were lots of videos that could be checked, there were careful records of what signs were used and when, and lots of testing. Nim initially learns really quickly, but then suddenly the researcher who was in charge of the study, Herb Terrace, publishes papers saying that Nim is not learning language and that none of the other apes were either. So what was going on? Nothing Nim does looks and fits the criteria for language. He wasn't inventing words. He wasn't getting word order correct. He didn't learn more meanings when he learned more signs. Just more signs for the same sorts of things. And he fundamentally, and perhaps crucially, isn't using them in a language-like way, the way that young children might. There's nothing spontaneous. He doesn't volunteer anything. He doesn't ask. If you ask him a question, you get a response, but that's basically it. So how can we try and break it down? There were definitely problems with many of the ape language studies. Here you can see Penny Patterson and Coco. Look carefully at what Coco signs, and then at what Penny says.
Who is that? Think me there. Okay, that is you. Gorilla. Animal. Coco love. Okay, that's very good. That is you. You are a lovely animal.
So in that clip, Coco signs gorilla and Coco signs love. But what does that mean? What is Coco trying to say there? She loves gorillas. She, a gorilla, would like some love. Gorillas are lovely, that she is a lovely gorilla. It's all too easy when you spend decades in a close family-like relationship with somebody to start to read into what they're saying. But that's not how we do good science. On the other hand, when you're trying to do good science in these studies, you lose the fundamental principle of what they were about. Nim wasn't really raised in a family-like environment. He was taught to sign by dozens of inexperienced graduate students, and he was kept and tested and tested and tested and treated like a test subject. That's not what a human child experiences. Treating Nim scientifically took away the whole point of doing this study. I mean, when the study was over, Terrace allowed him to be sold to a biomedical facility. When Patterson's university wanted to send Coco to a zoo at the end of her work, Penny Patterson kidnapped her, drove across several state lines and refused to give her back. Now, there were scientific problems that were very real, but she was raised in much more of a loving family environment. So the whole field at this point collapses in the aftermath, and personally I'm very glad it did. These studies taught us an awful lot about the rich potential that we can see in ape communication and about the incredible lives that they live and that they can express. But what do you do when the study is over? You can't just send them back somewhere. If they were taken from the wild, their families were probably killed in order to get those ape babies. When they get too big or too strong to study, they often still have decades of life to live. But what kind of life is it? They've been raised as a human. They just don't know what it means to be a chimpanzee or a gorilla, and their well-being never recovers. So while we learned a lot, these studies cross fundamental ethical barriers that none of us would ever want to go back across today. So what do we do today to study how language evolved? Now, if I was interested in our physical development or even our tool use, I could dig up the fossilized bones that tell me things like when we started to walk upright or when we spent less time climbing in trees. But words do not make very good fossils. Instead, what we do is compare our behaviour to the behaviour of other modern species, not because a chimpanzee resembles some kind of human ancestor, but because we're looking for patterns of similarity and difference in the modern species that will allow us to travel back down our evolutionary journey. Is there something that's uniquely human? Or do we also see it in chimpanzees and bonobos, suggesting that our last common ancestor over 5 million years ago probably also had that capacity? Can we push those dates even further back in time by showing its presence in other apes or other primates? To do that, we need to take a look at how other apes communicate today. Now, first of all, we have to remember that to understand another species' communication, we need to understand the world they live in. Otherwise, we might miss extraordinary similarities with language just because at first they don't seem to look the same as how we might express them. Now, I don't know if Tinbergen or Larson puts it better here, but the fundamental point is that to understand chimpanzee communication, we need to understand what it means to be a chimpanzee. I focus my work for most of my career on the species, well, one of the species that we're most closely related to, chimpanzees. And while I've been lucky enough to work at sites right across Africa, the one that I've called home for over 15 years is the Budongo rainforest in northwestern Uganda. It's pretty comfortable. We have solar power, we have hot showers if somebody remembers to light a fire under them. But most importantly, I am surrounded by communities of wild chimpanzees living in the rainforest and communicating all of the time about the important and not so important things that go into their daily lives. So why go all the way out there though? Because I could look at natural chimpanzee communication in a captive group just by going to a zoo or a sanctuary. The apes there live in groups, they are using their own communication systems, they are in the same place every day, you would hope, and you can get incredibly rich, clear observations. Because no matter how much I might love it, you learn very quickly that the more beautiful the forest, the harder it is to spot your ape in it. And the prettier something is, the more you should very definitely not touch it. Fundamentally, the reason why I work in the field, though, is because I'm a pretty old-school ethologist at heart. And if I believe that all communication systems, like any other primate behaviour, including our own, are adapted in some way to the socio-ecological niche of the species that's using them, I need to understand what that world looks like. We can take just one ape subspecies, East African chimpanzees, and see that there are differences between wild and captive environments that might have a profound impact on how they develop and deploy their communication. Okay, first up, group size. Wild chimpanzees live in groups from 20 to over 200 individuals, and they have the full diverse demography. So in Waibira, where I work, there are males in their late 50s and there are young ones who are just a few months old. We have brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers, but also grandmas and grandpas, aunties and uncles, cousins, and everybody in between. In captivity, the groups are smaller, perhaps 10 or 15 individuals, and you're much less likely to be related to each other. So there are going to be differences in who you have to communicate with. Now, the physical environment's the obvious one, right? We know that no matter how good the conditions in a zoo or a sanctuary, you just can't compare that to kilometres of rainforest. But it's also about the behavioural contexts that change as a result. Wild chimpanzees go on patrol, they fight with the neighbours, they sneak the girl away on consortship, they hunt for other primates, they encounter their own predators. In captivity, it's not just that the environments are smaller and more open, but everything else changes. I mean, it is frowned upon to eat the monkeys from the cage next door, I assume. But there are also no limits on things like food or safety, and the apes are therefore going to be able to spend large amounts of their days in other activities like play. So the things they're communicating about are also likely to be very different. Study length is a good reality check for those of us who spend our lives doing field work. It takes much, much longer to do this kind of work, and just our gesture time alone, I think, has been over 25,000 hours of my life in observation time. In captivity, it's not just that you get more data more quickly, but you get data in much greater detail. So it opens up a whole suite of very different questions that you're able to ask there. This is not an either-or thing. We need both approaches to be able to answer the questions we're interested in. But for me, the really crucial one is when I study communication, I'm interested in social structure and social relationships, and there are going to be significant differences in who you meet, where, and how often. So a female East African chimp in the wild might not meet the rest of her group for weeks, maybe even months. In captivity, she would be at least in vocal contact, in auditory contact with every other individual in her group 24/7. So the way in which that's going to impact not just the signals you can use, but what information you have or what information you need to find out is likely to be very important. Now, chimp communication occurs in many different ways, everything from the bright pink of an estrus swelling to a play face or a panthoot that could carry kilometres through the forest, a soft pant call or a kiss or a hug gesture between friends, shaking hands to make up after you've had a fight. There's just an incredible array of different signals that they can use to navigate their daily lives. But do any of these have anything in common with human language? Well, first of all, we need to work out what language itself is, and language can be a pretty complicated thing. I mean, if you ask a biologist, a linguist, a psychologist, and a philosopher what language is, you're going to get 4 different answers. To be fair, if you ask 4 linguists what language is, you're probably going to get 4 different answers. So to make things a little bit easier, we're going to break it down and have a look at just 3 separate parts of it. We're going to look at lexicons, the words or signals that we have in our repertoire or our vocabulary. Semantics, the relationship between words and signals and the world around us. What do they mean? And syntax, how do we combine those things together into strings and structure? A lot of what you notice when you spend any time with chimpanzees, at least at first, are their vocalizations. They are frequent and they are loud. But what also becomes rapidly clear is that most of these are broadcast to the world at large. When you spend a bit more time with them, you notice that they also have an incredible array of gestures, hand and body movements that, unlike vocalizations, seem to most often be used to request specific things from other individuals, and that these start to look a little bit more like what we do with language. Now, many animal signals, in fact most animal signals, seem to be broadcast to the world at large. Like, we make broadcast signals too. If I'm in the kitchen and I pick up a pan that is too hot on the stove, and you're sitting there in the kitchen, when I yell because I've burned myself, you will understand that the pan was hot. You get information from the signal that I'm broadcasting. But I didn't yell with the intention of communicating that information to you. I would have yelled whether or not you were sitting there. I might yell a bit louder or a bit longer with an audience, but what I would do with language is fundamentally different. I choose to share an idea with a specific partner. So I could choose whether or not to tell somebody who walks into the kitchen a minute later not to touch the pan because it's hot, but not to tell you that because I know you know and they don't know. And I can choose to share that information even when my hand isn't burning anymore. Now, it revolutionized our understanding of non-human communication when we found out that the large repertoires of great ape gestures seem to be used to communicate ideas and information between specific individuals in that same language-like way. Now, today we can actually add an increasing number of other signals that might be used in the same fashion. So 1 or 2 of the chimp vocalizations. There's even apparently an interspecies fish hunting gesture. So with improving methods, we're starting to detect intentional communication more widely. But at least for now, it's still the case that it's only in ape gestures that we have an entire system of signals in which we can explore possible examples of how this intentional language-like communication is used. This is Zephyr, and Zephyr is going to be gesturing to Rahara, and you're going to see, hopefully, how we can tell that he's not just broadcasting information, but communicating to her. Now, to take an example of language use, if I wanted you to pass me the cake at dinner, then I wouldn't just broadcast, hopefully, cake, 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 cake at you. Even though I have a steady, some might say constant, desire for cake at that point, because I'm communicating to you as an individual, I'd ask you and then wait for your response. Please, could you pass me the cake? If you didn't pass it to me, I might ask again. If you still didn't pass it to me, or you did something terrible, like pass me the blue cheese, then I might ask again, or I might elaborate, adding a signal, the cake, please, by pointing. And finally, when you did pass it to me, I would stop to communicate as soon as you started, even though I haven't eaten it yet, and the stimulus that led me to produce the signal, my desire for cake, is still there. I now understand that you understand me, and so I can stop communicating. This is a two-way interaction between individuals, and we see many of those same behaviours when apes gesture. So Zephyr here has just shaken that branch and given a big loud scratch, and then he waited for a response. Rahara wasn't having it, so he repeated it, big scratch and shake, and again waiting for her response. Rahara's an old lady, she takes her time, so he repeats it again, shake, scratch, and this time elaborating, adding that little arm raise. And that seems to have done the trick. She's coming down slowly, is she, isn't she? Gives a little, just really. And then, okay, so she's come down, he can stop gesturing, and he can start to groom her. You can see that back and forth, that response waiting, that persistence, that shows that Zephyr here is not just broadcasting, groom you, groom you, groom you. He's interacting in a language-like way. It's a conversation. Okay, so let's take a look at the story so far. Probably the first step for us, like in most studies of a communication system, was to try and work out what the signals were. And over the years, our research group has worked to establish what the basic repertoires of gesture types might be. Now, we looked at all of the ways that apes were moving their body and checked to see if they met those criteria for intentional language-like communication. And it turns out that a lot of them did. And importantly, there seem to be some interesting similarities across the different ape species. So we found that the basic repertoires of gestures for any one species are huge, often 80 distinct signals. It can take decades to see some of the more rarely used forms, but they're all present in the species repertoire. But these repertoires are very similar across the ape family, and more closely related species show greater overlap in their gesture types and just a few specific ones. So if you're a chimpanzee, you have 36 gestures that all the apes are using, another 30 that just the African apes are using, gorillas, bonobos, chimps, another couple that chimpanzees and bonobos are using, and then just another couple that only chimpanzees use, and you can put all that together to get your 70 or 80 gestures. Now, we've been working over the years to connect the dots and fill in the family tree by studying all of these different species in the wild. But there was still one ape that always eluded us. Us. And it was a puzzle, because if gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos share almost 80% of their gestures, what happened to that gestural inheritance over the last 5 or 6 million years since we diverged? I mean, in biological terms, a chimpanzee is much more closely related to us than she is to a gorilla. So if the chimps and gorillas have that in common, what happened to our gestural inheritance? Now, we've been playing around with a couple of new approaches to try and turn the tables on comparative research by using our ape field methods to investigate human use and understanding of these gestures. So we studied human apes. We studied 1 to 2 year olds. We had a very small group, but from several countries. And the idea was that at this age, children are on the cusp of acquiring language. They understand the basics of communication, but they don't necessarily have the full vocabulary to express all of their goals. And so perhaps they might be expressing them in different ways. Now, we coded their gestures as if they were young apes, which they are, and we made no prior assumptions about any of the sort of communicative intent that you might assign to humans in general, so it doesn't matter if that child gave the most beautiful pointing gesture, if it wasn't accompanied by those markers of intentional language-like use, response weighting, persistence that we look for in apes, we didn't code it. If they did something that might look a little bit strange, like a funny little handshake, but that it was accompanied by those markers of intentional language-like use, we did code it. That's exactly what we would do for a chimpanzee. Now, we hoped that we might find a few of the ape gestures still in use, because many of these gestures are very familiar, reaching out your hand to ask for something, flinging it to say go away, or raising your arm in the air. What actually happened kind of blew our minds. So we were able to show almost 50 distinct gesture types. And when we looked in a bit more detail, the overwhelming majority were present in both children and chimpanzees. And actually, a couple of these gestures that weren't in the chimpanzees were from the gorilla repertoire. Now, this was a tiny data set, so please take it with a very large pinch of salt. But at the same time, finding such richness in such a small data set tells us how powerful an approach this might be. And the next thing that we're doing is immediately now trying to do this properly, getting a big data set with many more children by looking at children up to 5 or 6 years old so we can see what happens to these gestures as language is coming online. But it does look like even as language users, human apes still have access to our ape ancestral gestural heritage. Okay, what does it all mean anyway? I mean, the next step in exploring a system of communication has to be to ask what the signals mean. But it actually took us an awfully long time to do this, because it's only in the last few years that we finally amassed the very big data sets that you need to be able to try and answer that question. Because it's not actually such an easy question to answer. It can be pretty difficult to know what another human being that you know really well means to say when they say something, right? We have all, I hope, put our foot in it spectacularly at times. So finding out what another human from another culture, let alone from another species, means to say is really difficult. Now, what a lot of early studies did was to look at the context in which these gestures were used. They were used in feeding, they were used in traveling, they were used in fighting. And they would assign that, so that's a feeding gesture, that's a fighting gesture, that's a traveling gesture. But this doesn't really describe what the signaler is intending to communicate, what they're meaning to say. You know, we can't observe the internal mental state. We can't mind read these chimpanzees. So how do we get around it? Because using context can be pretty problematic. Imagine that I have a gesture that means stop. Now, I use that gesture when we're traveling and feeding and fighting and playing, so you think that that gesture's meaning, taken from context, is really flexible, whereas from my perspective as a signaler, it's really fixed, it's very specific. So this might give us a sort of false sense of flexibility if we use context. So how can we do better than that? Well, some researchers started to look at what the outcome was. So what happens next? When I gesture, what do you do next? The thing is, that doesn't really get you the whole way, because what you might do next is misunderstand me, you could ignore me, you could tell me to get stuffed, you could negotiate back with me. So again, it doesn't really get you to the meaning that I was intending to communicate by looking just at your behaviour. Instead, we have to look at both. What we do is we record the behaviour that stops the signaler from signalling. Now, if we go back to that cake example, the one thing guaranteed to actually stop me finally asking you for the cake is when you start to pass me the cake. Now, again, it's not going to be perfect. There will still be times when I as a signaler maybe just gives up, or we as scientists make mistakes. But over time, over dozens and hundreds of cases, we can start to see the pattern emerging. So if a gesture reliably elicits a behavioural response, no matter who uses it or who the recipient was, we can start to describe what it means to the signaler. Here's an example of what that might look like. So at the bottom here, we have lots of different possible behavioural outcomes by the recipient, whether that's travel with me, give me that thing, let's groom. And the line here represents the frequency with which we see a particular response for a specific gesture used by a particular individual. And we can build that picture up over time by looking at the same gesture as it's used by many different individuals. Now, as we start to see, what emerges is a really clear pattern to the gesture's use. It doesn't seem to matter who the signaler is or who the recipient was in that case. The gesture itself has a common shared meaning. It's not always a fixed one-to-one association. So in some cases like here, gestures can be associated with a couple of different meanings. But again, that's actually much more like human language than we typically see in other species communication. Something like an alarm call is often highly fixed. It's very specific to a particular context, and you would want it to be right. You don't want any ambiguity about a danger signal. Human language, like ape gesture, is flexible. The same word could mean different things at different times. The word bark, if it's tree bark or a dog barking. And in the same way, the same gesture can be used to express 1, 2, or 3 meanings. Much of what we use language for is also not urgent in the same sense. We use it to communicate about day-to-day things, to gossip about, our friends, or to put things on the internet. And that's also really what apes are using their gesture for a lot of the time. The different meanings that apes are using their gestures to express, whether that's give me that thing to get lost, are just the little things to get through the day, to navigate their day-to-day social interactions. Now, something that emerges from our data is that we only have about 19 meanings, 4 of which are to do with play, 13 are requests for things, 2 of them are negations, but we have over 80 different gesture types, right? So with only 19 meanings and 80 types, there seems to be some redundancy in the system. And it's not equally distributed. So some outcomes are achieved by just 1 or 2 gestures, and other outcomes and meanings are represented by a whole suite of different gestures. And when we look at the goals that were being communicated, this starts to perhaps make a little bit more sense. Because when you're asking to be groomed as a chimpanzee, you can probably do that in a very similar way across many different recipients. But if you want to say stop that, you might need to do it in a different way if you're asking your little sister as opposed to asking the alpha male. More socially risky goals seem to be associated with a bigger range of gestures, perhaps allowing a bit more nuance in the communication. Now, of course, it also probably reflects the fact that our ability to describe chimpanzee meanings is a pretty blunt tool right now. So, for example, it's limited to imperative requests to do something, because I need to see that behavioural change in your behaviour in order to be able to work out what the gestures mean. If apes had a declarative gesture, a gesture that said, "Oh, what a beautiful fig tree," then I wouldn't necessarily be able to decode that with our current methods at the moment. So we're working on ways to refine it. Okay, the last one for now, putting all of those signals together. Now, I'm just going to touch on this quite quickly because syntax and structure and sequences is definitely our biggest work in progress. But I'd like to introduce you to something that we found out just recently about a pattern in the sequences of chimpanzee gestures. Now, something that we see across all human languages is a pattern called Mensarathor. It basically says the longer the sequence, the shorter the parts that make that sequence up. So a long sentence tends to be made of shorter words than a short sentence. A long word has shorter syllables than a short word. Now, we know that chimpanzees are combining their gestures together into sequences. We just saw that with Zephyr gesturing to Rahara. So he was combining gestures together, he was adding more gestures into the sequence after earlier ones failed. And what we see when we look is exactly the same pattern in chimpanzee gestures. The more gestures in a sequence, the shorter each individual gesture in that sequence is. So now, after more than a decade of work, we've put the language pieces together, right? It is probable that ape species have been using gestural systems of communication in an intentional language-like way for perhaps 10 to 15 million years. And the same gestures we see being used today by orangutans, gorillas, bonobos, and chimpanzees are also being used by very young children. We know that great apes have large repertoires of gestures that they're using in everyday communication in a language-like way to achieve goals. We know that means we can talk about meaning from the signaler's perspective, not just broadcasting information, and that they combine these gestures into sequences that share some of the fundamental structural properties seen in sequences in human languages. We should be really pleased, right? And yet, but no, because no matter which way you look at it, it still doesn't look like what we're doing with human language. Zephyr gesturing to O'Hara was not exactly astrophysics or Shakespeare. It was not exactly a knock-knock joke. Perhaps human language is different not because of the system that we have available to us, not because of the tools in our toolbox, our ability to produce this sound or this sign and combine it with that sound or this gesture. We clearly share those capacities with other primate species. Perhaps what's different is what we're doing with them. Sidney Brenner was a molecular biologist, and he was talking here about DNA when he said the difference between the telephone directory and a Shakespeare play is that while both have a grand cast of characters, only the play has a plot. Trying to explain why the structure of DNA that we know now in great detail, the instructions for life, so to speak, doesn't get us all the way to describing human behaviour. Now, our current approach to studying other species' communication gives us the letters. It gives us the grand cast of characters that can make a telephone directory. It tells us some of the rules about how they're combined and what tools are available to us, like other ape species. But what about the plot? If language is not different because of the tools that we have available to us, is it different because of what we use it for? The first evidence that we have for tool use goes back at least 3 million years. Now, that is long before modern humans were around as a species. And for the past 2.98 million years or so, it stayed pretty much the same for humans or chimpanzees, who are also a stone tool using species. But suddenly something happened in the last 20,000 years that after all of those millions of years of stone tools took us from stone tools to the iPhone, to the modern city in a heartbeat. Now, importantly, in evolutionary terms, this is a lightning flash. We almost certainly had language-like communication, if not full-blown language, for tens, hundreds of thousands of years beforehand, perhaps millions of years beforehand. So this is not about us having a new system of communication. This is not about us changing in our bodies or biology. This is not enough time for us to have fundamentally changed our genetic makeup. Modern humans were around as a species long before this. We must have started to use those tools in our toolkit in a different way. Perhaps that was for communicating about new things, for commenting and sharing and teaching and acquiring knowledge in different ways. But it does mean that it's not the system ourselves, but how our species has been using that system that continues to allow us to change both ourselves and the environment rapidly and radically today. We know an awful lot now, perhaps, about what that first sentence might look like. But we still have almost no idea what that first sentence might have been used for. And I think if we want to truly understand why language emerged and what makes language apparently unique as a system of communication, we need to understand what we were using it for as a species. So what can we say? Well, modern humans have a range of cognitive and linguistic abilities. But each of those abilities overlaps with the cognitive and communicative abilities that is present in any other species communication today, but in particular great apes. Humans have a unique combination of some of those abilities, but most importantly, they are using them to do some very unique, sometimes very special things. But just to end on a note of caution here, I could say exactly the same thing about modern chimpanzees and their unique combination of cognitive and communicative abilities. I could say the same thing about killer whales, about crows. And after all, Humans, and I can speak from experience here, make pretty terrible chimpanzees, no matter how long you spend in a rainforest, and we make particularly terrible killer whales or crows. We are not some pinnacle of evolution. Language is not fundamentally better than any other animal's system of communication. It just gives us exactly what we need it to do. Now we just have to work that part out. So I would like to say a huge thank you to everybody else that I work with, because all of the work that I've talked about today is not my work. It is the work of a huge group of people, mostly based here in St. Andrews, but also around the world. And I'd just like to say thank you for having listened and for giving me your attention. And I will be around on the day this goes out to answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much.